The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling park. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves whispering like soft whispers between friends. People walked briskly along the paved pathways, some jogging, others strolling hand in hand, enjoying the pleasant weather. It was the perfect kind of afternoon, with the air filled with the scent of fresh grass and the distant sound of children laughing as they played on swings. In the middle of it all, James sat on a worn wooden bench under a large oak tree. His black leather jacket rested comfortably against his shoulders, the collar turned up just enough to shield him from the chill breeze. He held a book in his hands, flipping through the pages with a calm and collected air. He wasn't in a rush, wasn't trying to fit into the busy pace of the world around him. His mind was focused on the words in front of him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he lost himself in the story. James was a tall, well-built man with a quiet presence that commanded respect without saying a word. His smooth, dark skin contrasted beautifully with the light fabric of his jeans and the crispness of his shirt. His face, though serious at times, was expressive, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. There was a certain ease in his demeanor, a calmness that reflected his sense of confidence and self-assurance. He had no need to prove anything to anyone. For James, moments like this were rare but precious. Life had its way of keeping him busy. But today he simply wanted to rest, something that seemed trivial to most, yet meaningful to him. He'd spent the last few days dealing with the stresses of work, responsibilities, and the hustle of city life. Today he had decided to take a break and enjoy the simplicity of nature. His thoughts were unburdened, his body relaxed, and he felt at peace with himself. But his tranquility was about to be shattered. Across the park, a woman watched him. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, a frown etched across her face as her eyes narrowed at James. Her name was Karen, and there was something in her demeanor that set her apart from the other park-goers. She stood out in her sharply tailored blouse and jeans, a stark contrast to the casual attire of the others around her. The harshness of her expression was what caught James's attention first, though he didn't think much of it at the time. Karen was in her mid-40s, with a sharp, almost regal look about her. Her platinum blonde hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless. To an outsider, she seemed like any other woman, out enjoying a peaceful afternoon in the park. But there was something in the way she looked at James that made him uneasy, something that felt different. Karen watched him for a moment longer, her brow furrowing as her eyes scanned him from head to toe. There was an odd discomfort building in her chest, an itch she couldn't quite scratch. She didn't know why, but something about this man just didn't sit right with her. She felt out of place herself, as though he had intruded upon her space, her world. "Who does he think he is, sitting there like he owns the place?" she thought, the judgment in her mind growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just his presence that bothered her. It was the fact that he didn't belong. This wasn't his neighborhood, his park. It was hers, and he didn't fit. He looked different, and that was enough for Karen to draw conclusions. She told herself that she was just being cautious. She had seen enough stories in the news to know that certain people just didn't belong in certain places. Her mind was racing now, filled with thoughts of suspicion and unwarranted fear. She wondered if he was a threat. Maybe he was up to something, maybe something illegal. She couldn't put her finger on it, but her discomfort was growing by the second. And then, like a spark in a dry field, the thought flashed in her mind, what if he's dangerous? She felt the need to act, to do something about this feeling that was gnawing at her. Her heart started to beat a little faster as her fingers trembled, reaching for her phone. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to even explain what she was seeing. "He's just sitting there, but something feels off," she muttered under her breath, as though the words would somehow validate her feelings. Karen's fingers dialed the number for the police, her eyes never leaving James. She spoke quickly, her voice tight with urgency. Hello, yes, I'm in the park, and there's a man sitting here. He looks suspicious. I don't know, just doesn't belong here. Can you send someone to check it out? She exaggerated the situation, her voice laced with fear, making James seem more threatening than he actually was. He's acting strange. I don't know what he's doing here, but it's making me uncomfortable. The dispatcher on the other end of the line assured her that help was on the way, but Karen was already convinced that she had done the right thing. As the phone call ended, she stood tall, her arms still crossed as she glared in James's direction. The discomfort in her chest was gone now, replaced by a sense of justified action. She was sure of it now. She had done what needed to be done. And in the back of her mind, a quiet thought lingered. I just did the right thing. He shouldn't be here. The distant hum of city traffic faded slightly as the sound of sirens cut through the park. For a brief moment, James didn't notice the flashing lights. He was absorbed in his book, his mind lost in the words that danced across the pages. But the sound grew louder, and before long he could hear the unmistakable roar of a police car approaching. Karen, on the other hand, stood frozen, her eyes locked on the path leading into the park. The officer was coming. She couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her, as if the moment of validation she had been waiting for was finally upon her. She had made the call, and now the officer would do what she couldn't: confront this man and remove him from her park. As the patrol car came into view, Karen's chest tightened with anticipation. She stood taller, her arms still crossed tightly, her eyes narrowing as she awaited the officer's arrival. She could already picture it: James being questioned, maybe even arrested. She felt vindicated in her actions. The police car came to a smooth stop in front of James's bench, its sirens fading as the officer stepped out of the vehicle. The officer was tall, well-built, and wore a dark blue uniform that contrasted sharply with the bright afternoon sky. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his nameplate read, Officer Davis. His hat sat squarely on his head, his demeanor professional and calm, even as he surveyed the scene. Officer Davis wasn't in any rush. He wasn't here to make assumptions or pass judgment. His approach was deliberate, measured. He had learned long ago not to jump to conclusions. He had seen enough to know that not every situation was as it seemed. He was a man with experience, both in law enforcement and in the complexities of human nature. He had been on the force for years, and during that time he had seen his fair share of false accusations, racial bias, and situations where appearances could be deceiving. He had learned to walk into every situation with an open mind, to listen before reacting. As he walked toward James, he took in the scene with practiced ease. He noticed Karen standing off to the side, her eyes wide with nervous energy, clearly eager for some kind of action. He had dealt with situations like this before, people quick to judge, people too certain in their own assumptions. Karen's eyes followed Officer Davis as he made his way toward James, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority, as though she were in control of the situation. She had called the police, and now they were here to handle it. She expected the officer to approach James with caution, maybe even demand that he leave the park immediately. In her mind, this was the moment when her suspicion would be validated. He's guilty. He must be, she thought, the belief almost solidifying in her mind. She could already hear the officer's words in her head, telling James to move along or face consequences. Finally, this will be over. But Officer Davis wasn't like that. As he walked towards James, he wasn't in a rush. He didn't have the usual urgency that some officers might display when responding to a call. Instead, he approached with a calm, almost methodical pace. His steps were measured, his eyes observant but not judgmental. He could tell that James was not the kind of man to cause trouble. The way he sat, absorbed in his book, told Officer Davis everything he needed to know about his character. As the officer reached James, he stopped a few feet away, his body language open and non-threatening. "Good afternoon, sir," he said in a clear, polite tone. "I'm Officer Davis. Is everything okay here?" James looked up from his book, his expression calm and neutral. He wasn't surprised by the officer's arrival. He had noticed the sirens earlier, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, with the officer standing in front of him, he simply smiled and nodded. "Everything's fine, officer. Just enjoying some quiet time." Officer Davis assessed James for a moment, his gaze steady but not invasive. "I got a call saying there was a concern about you being here," he said, keeping his tone even, non-threatening. "Do you mind if I ask what you're doing?" James closed the book gently, placing it beside him on the bench. "I'm just reading," he explained, his voice calm and respectful. "Taking a break from the day." Officer Davis nodded, glancing briefly over his shoulder to where Karen stood watching the interaction. He noticed the tension in her body, the way she was holding herself, as if waiting for something to happen. He wasn't sure what had prompted her to make the call, but he wasn't going to make any assumptions. Turning back to James, Officer Davis continued, "I understand. Just making sure everything's all right. We've had some concerns raised, and I'm here to make sure everyone's safe." James gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I understand, officer. No problem at all." He spoke respectfully, his demeanor unruffled. He wasn't about to get agitated over a misunderstanding. The way he spoke and carried himself showed that he had been in situations like this before. He knew how to handle the pressure of being wrongfully scrutinized without letting it affect his composure. As Officer Davis took a moment to assess James's response, Karen watched eagerly from the side. She had her arms tightly crossed, a subtle smirk playing on her lips. She was certain that the officer would see what she saw, that James didn't belong here, that something was off about him. Her mind raced with assumptions and half-formed conclusions. "He's just trying to act calm," she thought, convinced that James was hiding something. "He's guilty. He knows he's in trouble." But Officer Davis wasn't about to give in to Karen's unspoken pressure. He had learned to deal with people like her, those who were quick to judge others based on appearances alone. He wasn't going to let Karen's prejudices cloud his judgment. He turned back to Karen, who was now watching him with intense anticipation. "Ma'am," he said politely, his voice calm but firm, "can you tell me exactly what the concern is? What made you feel uncomfortable?" Karen's eyes flicked nervously from the officer to James. She felt her pulse quicken as the officer's focus shifted toward her. She hadn't expected this. She had expected James to be questioned, maybe even escorted out of the park. But now the officer was questioning her. He's just sitting there," Karen stammered, trying to sound confident. "He doesn't belong here. I don't know who he is, but he's making me feel uneasy. He's been staring at people, acting strangely. I thought maybe you should check on him." Officer Davis raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral. "Staring at people?" he repeated. "You think that's suspicious?" Karen's mind scrambled for something else to say, but she couldn't come up with any more concrete details. She had already exaggerated her accusations, and now she was on the defensive. The officer's questioning had stripped away the foundation of her assumptions, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't going the way she had imagined. James remained calm, sitting back and watching the exchange unfold. He didn't need to say anything. Officer Davis had already done what needed to be done. He was in control of the situation, and the weight of the injustice that had brought him here was becoming clear to everyone watching. The conversation had been civil up to this point. Officer Davis had maintained a calm and professional demeanor, carefully listening to Karen's accusations, even as he grew more skeptical of her claims. He turned his attention back to James, who was still sitting on the park bench, his posture relaxed despite the growing tension in the air. It was in that moment, as Officer Davis looked at James, that a sudden realization struck him. His brow furrowed slightly as his eyes narrowed in recognition. Wait a minute. I know him. The officer had seen James before. Not just once, but several times over the past few years. James wasn't just any ordinary man in this city. He was well known, a figure respected by many in the community. James was the local head of a nonprofit organization focused on social justice, working with underprivileged youth in the neighborhood. He had spoken at community meetings, helped organize charity events, and was regularly featured in local news for his efforts to make the city a better place. His calm, composed demeanor wasn't just a reflection of his character, it was also a testament to the important work he did in his community. Officer Davis had even seen him a few months ago at a fundraising dinner for the local shelter. As a local law enforcement officer, he had attended to show support for the event, and James had been one of the keynote speakers. Now the officer realized with a jolt of recognition that this was the very same James. The man sitting before him, minding his own business in the park, was the same person who had worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between the community and law enforcement. The officer was now in a difficult position. He had known James's reputation. He had admired the work he did, but now here he was, caught in the middle of a completely baseless accusation. The moment of recognition was almost surreal. Officer Davis stood still for a moment, his gaze shifting between James and Karen as the gravity of the situation settled in. Karen, however, didn't notice. She was too busy, still anxious and awaiting the officer's next move. Her heart was racing, and she was almost certain that any moment now the officer would begin questioning James more intensely or tell him to leave. Her suspicions about James being out of place were still swirling in her mind, and she was waiting for the validation she believed would come. But then, with a soft yet deliberate voice, Officer Davis spoke. James Carter, right?" The words hung in the air for a moment, and Karen froze. She didn't know who James Carter was, but she could tell by the officer's tone that something had shifted. James's demeanor didn't change, but the recognition in Officer Davis's voice was unmistakable. James raised an eyebrow, his calm expression never wavering. "That's me," he said, nodding slightly. "I didn't expect you to remember me, officer." The officer smiled, his demeanor suddenly warmer. "It's hard to forget someone who does as much for this community as you do. I've seen you speak at the shelter fundraiser. You've really made a difference around here, James. It's good to see you." Karen's face drained of color as the officer's words sank in. She blinked a few times, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process the revelation. This wasn't just any man in the park. This was someone important, someone who had a legacy in this town. For a moment, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. The image she had built of James, the one she had painted in her mind, as suspicious, out of place, and even dangerous, was shattered in an instant. The man she had called the police on was a well-respected figure, a man whose presence in the park was not only justified, but actually celebrated. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from shock. She had made a grave mistake, and now the consequences of her actions were beginning to sink in. I didn't realize. I didn't know," Karen stammered, her voice betraying her panic. She could feel her palms sweating as she fumbled with her words. "I didn't know you were someone important. Important," James interjected, his tone still calm, but laced with an underlying tension. "I'm just a guy who loves this community. I'm trying to make a positive impact, that's all." But Karen wasn't hearing him. She was too busy scrambling to backpedal to erase the damage she had done. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just worried, you know. I saw you sitting here, and I thought you didn't belong." Her words tumbled out in a jumbled mess as she tried to recover from the embarrassment. But the damage had already been done. Her initial judgment had been so quick, so certain, and now that certainty was crumbling beneath her. She had labeled James as suspicious purely because of his appearance, and now she was realizing the full extent of her mistake. Her eyes darted between James and Officer Davis, who was now standing tall, his posture no longer as relaxed as it had been moments before. The officer's presence had shifted from one of calm professionalism to one of quiet authority. Officer Davis turned to Karen, his tone now more serious. "Ma'am, what you've done here today is not only unfair, it's dangerous. You made an accusation without knowing anything about the person you were accusing. And worse, you based that accusation on assumptions that had nothing to do with reality. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment as the officer continued, his voice firm but not without a hint of disappointment. Racial profiling is a real problem. It's a problem that causes harm to innocent people every single day. And making false calls like the one you made doesn't just waste resources, it perpetuates a cycle of harm. James remained silent, his expression unchanged, but his heart swelled with a mix of emotions. He had lived through this kind of injustice before, but it never got any easier. He knew the toll that these kinds of accusations took on both individuals and communities. And now, as Karen stood there, fumbling for words, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. Not for himself, but for the message that was being delivered. The officer's words were piercing, and Karen finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. She opened her mouth to apologize, but nothing came out. She had already shown her true colors. Her judgment had been swift, and her apology, if it came at all, was hollow. "Next time," Officer Davis said, his gaze never leaving Karen, "think before you act. You may not have the luxury of being proven wrong next time." With that, the officer turned to James, offering a reassuring nod. "You're free to go, sir. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry you had to go through this." James stood up from the bench, his demeanor still calm, but the tension that had built up in his chest now seemed to dissipate. "No problem, officer," he said, his voice steady. "I just hope we can all learn something from this." As Officer Davis watched James walk away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had shown such grace in the face of baseless prejudice. He had seen too many instances of injustice, but this one was different. It was a reminder that the fight for fairness and respect was far from over. "No problem, officer," he said, his voice steady. "I just hope we can all learn something from this." As Officer Davis watched James walk away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had shown such grace in the face of baseless prejudice. He had seen too many instances of injustice, but this one was different. It was a reminder that the fight for fairness and respect was far from over. The weight of the situation hung in the air. Karen stood there, her eyes darting between James and Officer Davis, her face a mix of embarrassment, shame, and disbelief. The reality of what she had just done was sinking in. She had made assumptions, judged a man based solely on his appearance, and almost cost him his dignity, all without understanding who he truly was. James, however, remained calm, his posture still unflinching. He wasn't angry, though there was an undeniable frustration in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the first time he had been wrongly accused because of his race. It was a familiar feeling, one that he had dealt with countless times in different forms. But there was something different about today. He had a chance to turn this into a teaching moment, not just for Karen, but for anyone who might be watching. James took a slow, steady breath, his eyes meeting Karen's with quiet resolve. He wasn't going to react with anger, because he knew that would only reinforce the narrative she had tried to create. Instead, he chose a path that spoke volumes through his dignity. "You know," James began, his voice calm but firm, "we all come from different walks of life, but that doesn't mean we don't deserve the same respect. No matter where we're from, what we look like, or what we're doing in a particular moment, we all have value. The moment we start judging people based on how they look or the color of their skin is the moment we stop being human." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air between them. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her usual defense mechanism, that quick, dismissive judgment, was failing her now. She couldn't respond to James's calm wisdom. It was as if she were seeing him for the first time, not the stranger she had assumed him to be, but a person with thoughts, emotions, and a sense of self that deserved dignity. James continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "We all make mistakes. I'm not perfect, but that doesn't mean I have the right to dehumanize someone else, especially when I know nothing about them. And if I could say one thing to you, Karen, it would be to remember this. Look beyond the surface. People deserve more than assumptions. Karen stood still, her hands clenched at her sides. The defensiveness she had clung to earlier was slipping away. For the first time, she was forced to confront the depth of her actions, and it was uncomfortable. She had wanted to project power by making the call to the police to take control of a situation she felt was out of place. But now she was faced with the consequences of her judgment. Officer Davis, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. His voice was steady, his eyes narrowed with a sense of authority, but also a note of sympathy for James, who had been put in such a position. "Karen," Officer Davis said, his tone measured but firm. This could have gone a lot worse if James had reacted differently. He could have been angry, defensive, or confrontational, and things could have escalated quickly. But he didn't. He stayed calm. He handled himself with dignity. And now you're standing here, having to reckon with your actions. You don't get to put people in situations like this, based on your assumptions, and expect no consequences. Karen felt her face flush with the heat of shame. The officer's words stung, and for the first time she realized the true impact of what she had done. It wasn't just about calling the police, it was about the way her prejudice had shaped the way she saw James. She had dehumanized him before even giving him a chance, and now she was left to face the weight of that decision. Racial bias, Officer Davis continued, isn't just harmful in moments like this. It's systemic. It's a cycle. When you make assumptions based on someone's appearance, you're perpetuating that cycle. You're contributing to a culture where people are judged, even when they've done nothing wrong. His words were blunt but necessary. Karen's smugness was slowly but surely evaporating. She could no longer hold on to the belief that her actions were justified by her own sense of safety or rightful suspicion. She had been wrong. She had acted from a place of fear, ignorance, and prejudice. James' voice broke through the growing silence. "I don't want you to feel sorry for me, Karen," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I just want you to learn from this. Think before you make a judgment. Ask yourself why you felt the need to call the police. Was it because I was black, or because I was sitting here in a place where you didn't think I belonged?" Karen swallowed, struggling with the realization that her own biases had led her to act in a way that was unfair, unjust, and hurtful. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? What could she possibly? A moment for you to reflect, say, to undo the harm she had caused. James, sensing her confusion, softened his tone just slightly. "I'm not mad at you," he said, the weight of his words softer now, but still carrying their truth. "I just hope this is because the next time you make an assumption about someone, it might not be as easy to undo, and the consequences might be much more severe." The officer nodded in agreement. "This is a learning moment for all of us. We need to do better. And it starts with making sure we don't let fear and prejudice dictate how we see other people." For a long moment, there was silence. Karen's heart raced as she processed the full weight of what had just happened. She had made a snap decision to judge someone based on the color of his skin. She had assumed he didn't belong, and she had tried to use her privilege to correct what she perceived as wrong. But now, standing in front of her, was a man who had shown her exactly what true strength and maturity looked like. She took a deep breath, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter now. I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have judged you the way I did. I was wrong." James nodded, acknowledging her apology, though he knew words could only do so much. Actions, after all, spoke louder. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But remember, it's not just about saying sorry. It's about changing how we think and act from here on out. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The officer gave one last glance at Karen, his expression serious but not unkind. "We all have work to do," he said, "but it starts with acknowledging where we went wrong. Don't let this be another moment you forget." James turned to leave, his shoulders relaxed but his mind sharp, knowing that this moment would stay with him, and hopefully with Karen, long after today. Karen stood there for a moment, her gaze lingering on the ground, her face still flushed with the weight of shame. She could feel the eyes of both James and Officer Davis on her. But this time she didn't have the words to defend herself. The confidence she had once felt in making that call was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of regret and embarrassment. She had wanted control to make the situation right in her eyes, but now she understood just how wrong she had been. Without a word, Karen turned around, her steps slow and hesitant as she made her way back toward the street. Her body language spoke volumes. Her shoulders slumped, her head slightly bowed, and her posture deflated. It was as if the weight of her actions was too much to carry. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. The woman who had walked into the park earlier, so sure of her assumptions, was now a woman humbled by the consequences of her own prejudice. She didn't look back. She didn't speak to James, nor did she speak to the officer. The silence that followed her departure hung in the air, leaving the audience with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that her lesson had been learned, perhaps too late, but learned nonetheless. As Karen disappeared into the distance, the camera lingered on James and Officer Davis, who shared a brief, meaningful glance. There was a quiet understanding between them. Both knew that this moment wasn't just about today. It was about a much larger issue, one that needed to be addressed continuously. But the truth had been spoken, and that was enough for now. After a few moments, the stillness was broken by James, who turned toward Officer Davis with a small nod of appreciation. The officer, still standing tall, but now relaxed, met James's gaze with respect. "Thank you for handling that with such grace," Officer Davis said, his voice steady but laced with genuine admiration. "I've seen this kind of thing happen before, but it's not often that someone can stay so composed in a situation like that." James shrugged, a modest smile on his face. "I've been through worse, officer. It's part of the reality for some of us. But today wasn't about me. It was about making sure the right message was sent." The officer nodded. "And you sent it loud and clear. Sometimes it's not the ones who shout the loudest who make the biggest impact, but the ones who stay calm and firm in their conviction. You did that today." James smiled slightly, though his eyes still held a certain seriousness. "We all have a role to play in this. I'm just doing my part. But we all need to do better. More of us need to speak up, to do what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." The officer paused, considering James's words carefully. He knew that this was more than just one isolated event. It was a reflection of something deeper, a larger issue of bias, misunderstanding, and systemic inequality that couldn't be solved with a single conversation or one simple action. But today, at least, there had been progress. "I couldn't agree more," the officer said. "It's going to take time, but if more people acted the way you did today, we'd get there." James nodded, the weight of the conversation sinking in. "We're all part of this. No one is above it. We just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time." The camera slowly panned away from the two men, focusing on the park once more. Quiet, peaceful, but now infused with a deeper meaning. The message was clear. The day's events had been more than just a confrontation between a woman's prejudice and a man's dignity. It was a reminder of how important it is to see beyond the surface, to challenge our biases, and to treat everyone with the respect they deserve, regardless of their race, appearance, or background. James, though still walking away from the scene, seemed to embody something much bigger than himself. His actions had been a beacon of hope, a quiet but powerful statement that kindness, understanding, and fairness could break through the walls of hatred and division. In a world that often judged people too quickly, James had chosen to rise above the moment with grace. True strength is not in judging others, but in seeing them for who they truly are. Let's treat everyone with respect, no matter their race, no matter their appearance. The words lingered for a moment before the screen cut to the credits, leaving the audience with a sense of empowerment, hope, and the realization that small actions, when done with integrity, could create a ripple effect that changes the world for the better.